Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Behind the Bench, brought to you by the National Soccer Coaching Association of Canada. So this is part 2 of our online webinar that we started a couple of weeks ago. And today we're going to continue our discussion on the topics of where do we go from here. We'll be discussing some of the challenges that Canada faces with regards to talent ID and player development and coaching development, and how these challenges may have impacted on the performance of the U17 boys at the recent World Cup. And also hopefully we can look at what steps can be taken to improve our international performance, both on the youth side and maybe even on the senior side, right? So we're going to talk a little bit, I think we're going to talk a lot about player development, talent ID, coaching development, and we're going to talk about the role of the provincial associations and the Canadian soccer associations in getting things done right. Our panel today is an amazing panel. Stephen Hart, professional soccer coach, football coach, and Stephen has taken many roles of the Canadian Soccer Association, from Canada U17 head coach, Canada U20 men's team, the Canadian men's national team, Trinidad and Tobago men's national team, and head coach with XFX in Halifax. Stephen, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to sharing your thoughts and your experience with us.
Thanks for having me.
Bassam Naim, Academy Director of A&B Football. Bassam has got more certificates that I can name and count, and more experience in player development and talent ID than anybody else I know in Canada. US Youth National License, Canadian National A License, UEFA A License, Brazilian A License. And Bassam has traveled all over the world, attending many coaching conferences in Germany, Belarus, Turkey, Croatia, in Brazil, the US. Recently, he was in Colombia on a scouting trip with the with some French clubs. And Bassam also has some close professional working relationships with the French Federation and many clubs in Europe. Bassam, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good to see you all.
And last but not least, Richard Bucciarelli. Richard is the Director of Sports Science with NSCAC, Professor of Kinesiology at Guelph and Humber, professional fitness coach, university lecturer, researcher, a published author, and a proud father and a good friend. Richard, welcome.
Thanks, Tony. Good to see you.
All right. And I am Tony LaFerrara. I'm the technical director with NSCAC, and I will be your host for today. I also want to add, before we get started, that we have invited members of the Provincial Association, the Canadian Soccer Association, to join us in this very important discussion, but they have respectfully declined to participate. We hope that they will reconsider and accept our invitation to join us in future webinars, and there will be more about this. To the viewers, if you have any questions or comments, please use your chat box, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can. And to our panels, gentlemen, you are free to express your experiences, your opinions, and your viewpoints, but I encourage everyone to do it in a professional and respectful way. All right, and so here we go. So Stephen, I'm going to start with you, if it's okay, about player development in Canada. And, the issue of player development is not unique to Canada alone. Other nations like Italy, Germany, France, England, to name a few, they all of them have had difficulties in the past. And each country, raises unique challenges and demands. So following the results of the U17 at the World Cup, Stephen, do we take a pessimistic point of view and look at the glass being half empty and decide, we throw everything away and start all over? Or can we look at the glass being half full and continue to build from there? What do you think?
Well, I think you have to look at the glass being half full, okay? it's one of those situations where you cannot, you have expectations. Do our expectations match our commitment? Right? And when I say commitment to these youth programs, okay? And I'm not in a position to say how much money was spent, et cetera, et cetera. But what I will say is that, you know, the under-17 program has always been a complex one and a difficult one. And in my time was only 2 teams that qualified, right? And just to give you a little bit of background, Holger Osek had put me in charge. And one of the things he said to me was, listen, all I want you to do is to try and identify, you know, a certain type of player, and we're going to try and give them the exposure and the experiences on an international level. But that being said, you know, you really, from each youth program, you really, especially at under 17, you're trying to get, let's say, 3, if it's a really good program, but probably 2 players to move on to your senior national team. Right? The senior national team does not need 24 players coming from an under 17 program. It needs 2 or 3 players from each under 17 program. Okay? And if we get those players the experience of being at a World Cup, of living that sort of lifestyle and that sort of competition, and we do get 2 players from each program or 3 players from each program, I think you have to look at it as fairly successful, because I know people are going to say, well, we have far less competition at that age group to move on to the senior level than other countries do. But the reality is, in almost all the other countries, you're looking at 2 players, maybe 3, that move on to the senior program. Okay?
True, yeah.
But I will say that I don't think, just from the outside looking in, the commitment to those programs has been there in terms of preparation, the money to scout the programs properly. Just a quick glance at the team, the players basically come from 3 programs, and that worries me a little bit, because you know, I would ask, are we beating the bush enough to try and identify the potential talent that's there? And again, I don't know. I couldn't answer that because you know, I don't have the sort of statistics in front of me as to how much scouting was done, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, Stephen, I think this is one of the issues, I guess, or the question that everybody's asking is, are we doing enough to find the best talent, or are we just restricting ourselves to, well, let's name it, TFC, Montreal, and Vancouver, and that's it, and that's where we look at. Is there more out there? And if there is, how do we find it? How do we notice it? How do we bring them in? I think that's the question that maybe, you know, we will try to answer later as well. But some, you know, around the same question that I was asking Stephen. You've been around, you know, you've been around, and you've been in soccer in Canada for a long time. You've seen player development in Canada. You've seen player development in France. You develop players, and you take them to Europe, and a lot of them have been very, very successful. So, what is your experience? You know, player development, comparing all of the different countries you've been in. Player development in Canada and France and all of the other places you've been at. How can you compare that?
Well, I see it as in twofold, this question for me. One fold is, what are the objectives actually that we have as a nation? And are we achieving those objectives? If the objective to be a participation or a sports participation, or soccer being a sports participation in Canada, for kids to be active, for kids to be involved, to be some kind of healthy environment, then we do have a good environment overall because we have a decent grassroots, I guess, following or an attraction, and we have kids are being active. I've been involved in the game now in many, many years, as you mentioned, 25 years on a full-time basis. I do not know what the, in all honesty, I do not know what the objectives are that we have from our national association, from our government to start with, because not just the Soccer Canada, I think government has to be involved, into the national association, into the provincial association, into the regional association. What are we trying to do? Are we trying to be just active? So if we're trying to be just active, we're good. We're active. We have a lot of kids playing, male, female, senior, the rest of it. If we're trying to achieve objectives, what are we trying to achieve first? What's the objectives? I don't know these objectives. I personally have objectives for my little world that I work in. That's not enough. I know there's other people working separately. Obviously, even though we don't live close, Stephen and I know Stephen for years, and he's a friend and a colleague. And we all have personal objective and professional objectives. So, and that's the big problem that I see in a great country like Canada, that we talk big in terms of we are a football nation. I'm not sure what that means to start with. That we have to make the World Cup, but who made that decision? I apologize here with the phone. And what's the decision? Is this a plan to make the World Cup, or is it just once every 30 odd years? Do we have the funding? Do we have the resources? Do we have the blueprint on how we're going to do it? Is it shared with the clubs around the country? Why are we only selecting players from 3 organizations? For the life of me, I don't understand it, for an example. So it's easy. Player development, actually, it's a proven equation today on the world stage. It doesn't change from one country to another, per se. The equation itself, or the essence of the equation. The only what changes is actually the cultural attachment to it. So, for an example, in France, they do it in the French way. With, I always say it, they like the baguette and the cheese. In Italy, they do it with a nice espresso, per se, right? So they have their cultural way of developing their own player. But they have it in terms of, they have objectives, they have a clear pathway, they have a clear understanding to what's needed for youth player. And are we talking just youth? Are we talking about youth to get them into the pros? And how do we get, even if we prepare them to get them into the pros, where do we put them in our country? It's a big question, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think, later on we'll get into more specifics in terms of, what do you do? What are the things that are successful in player development? So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Richard, I wanted to ask you a question. It's not only about passing and receiving, right? It's not about just shooting and scoring goals. There is a science behind it as well, isn't it? You and I have spoken many times about this because we're both passionate about this. We talk about peak height velocity. We talk about the relative age effect. How does the relative age effect affect player development?
Okay, so first of all, I guess we got to define our terms, right? So relative age effect is just a name that's given to this phenomenon where a disproportionate number of athletes, and we can, we're talking soccer here, so we'll stick with soccer. So a disproportionate number of youth soccer players are identified for higher level programs, whether that's provincial, national, professional, that are born in the first 3 months of the year, January, February, March. Okay, when I say disproportionate, more or less, we would expect if this effect didn't exist, that 25% of the players in a high-level program would be born in those 3 months, and 25 in the next 3, and you'd have kind of a normal distribution. But we don't have that. Anyway, that effect is not unique to soccer. It's not unique to Canadian soccer. Actually, that effect was identified. I mean, I saw it 20 years ago. It's possible even before that. But when I first started attending conferences, and people from all over the world were talking about it. I remember I presented at a conference in Turkey in 2007, there were people from England, from France, from West Africa, from all over the world that were noticing this, and so in any case, it doesn't make sense that coaches would be identifying all of their players, or 60 or 70 or 80%, let's say, of their players that are born in those 3 months, unless there's some kind of selection bias, meaning the players that are born a little bit earlier in the year are more likely to be bigger, stronger, faster. And it's not just physical development, there's also cognitive development. So if you're born earlier, you may be, I don't want to say smarter, but from an understanding of the game standpoint, from positioning, tactics, responding to coaching instructions, all of that, the selection may be biased towards those players, not because they're better, but because they've developed earlier. And then the next level to that, because that's a problem and that needs to be addressed, but the next level to that, and kind of the way you address it, is that there are very simple tests that can be done to very accurately predict the second term that you mentioned, which is peak height velocity. Peak height velocity is simply the age where athletes reach their maximum rate of growth. And we call that usually the growth spurt. So it kind of happens right after puberty. For boys, the average age of peak height velocity is 13.5, which means that on average, boys will hit their growth spurt at 13.5. When you do these tests with teams of younger boys, and under 17 is still in that category because they're still only 16, they're not done growing yet. Often what you find, and I've got some stuff published on this, and I've got honestly probably 20,000 tests that I've done, so I know it pretty well. Most teams in the youth age groups, from even as young as 10 or 11 and all the way through to kind of the last year of high school, there's a range in developmental age, meaning a range in the age at which the kids reach their growth spurt or are predicted to reach it. And that range is 3 to 4 years. So what that means is that if there's a coach of a youth team coaching 14-year-old boys, for example, if you don't do those tests, then you may have some late developers who are developmentally only 13 or 12, and you may have some early developers who are developmentally 15 or 16, and they're all together. And so if these tests aren't done, then it makes no sense for us to talk about relative age effect, and it certainly makes no sense to talk about physical ability of players, because it's only fair to compare the physical ability of players who are developmentally similar. And, are these tests being done at the high performance so-called, youth programs in the provinces and in Canada? The answer is no. So, well,
Richard, and I'm going to take I'm going to play the devil here with everybody here, just so that, we don't go in one direction, so we can go in different directions. It is a, valuable scientific concept, but it's very difficult to administer, to measure. Is it?
Can I challenge you on that? Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So actually, all you need to do is you need to know the player's birthday. You need to know sex, male or female. You need to measure their height standing, their height sitting in a chair, and you need to know the height of that chair, and their body weight.
Right.
And there's a predictive equation that is free and available online. You can even Google peak height velocity calculator, and you can find it. So it's not difficult to do. It's not difficult, and it's a very accurate predictor. And if we had people in charge of the provincial and national associations that understood how important this was, then they would make it mandatory for this data to be collected. It would be very easy. You could probably test an entire provincial program with these measurements in about 30 minutes.
Wow. So, yeah. Well, Rick, yeah. So player development, then it's not a simple task. There's a lot of things involved in it, from the scientific point of view, from a physical point of view, from a technical learning. The environment plays a big part in it. There are, so many components in it, right? That ultimately will make it for the best way to develop players. I personally know some clubs and some academies who do a really good job at that, a very good job at that. They take the time to do all of these things, and the best way they can, right? But then there are other ones that don't do that. And so, but we'll get to that. But player development, it's not, it's a little bit more complex. Your environment, your culture, your, the scientific approaches that you take to it. It's not as simple as it is. But once you start doing things right, then everything falls into place, right? It's not difficult anymore. Yeah. Stephen, I want to ask another question about something that Bassam said about player development. And, I'm trying to remember when you, it wasn't long ago when you were coaching the national team and the players you had on that team. I'm talking about the men's team and the players that are there now on both the men's and the women's sides. We have players that are playing on some of the best clubs in the world. On the women's side, Man United, Man City, Arsenal, Chelsea, they're all over. Juventus. These are Canadian women soccer players playing in Europe. On the men's side, Bayern Munich, Benfica, Lille, France, you name it. And now David is rumored to go to AC Milan. And Buchanan rumored to go to Man City or Inter Milan. So doing something right, are we, Stephen?
Well, yeah, I think you would have to say so based on what you just said, that something is right. And I mean, in my time, it was very, very different. The expenditure, as I said, the commitment from the association to the team. We just didn't have the money, so you went into it knowing that you can only bring 18 players into camp and your staff was very small, etc., etc. That being said, we still had players developing in spite of the lack of a player development model per se. Now, some people may argue, well, that's still the case. That we are still developing players in spite of. Now, I would hazard to guess that the women's program is probably further ahead than the men's in terms of the player production. But that being said, a large core of the players that are being phased out were there all the way back to before 2005, but from a men's side, I mean, we only had a pool, if I could remember correctly, of about 26 players. We have a lot more players now playing abroad, playing at a professional level, a lot more.
Yeah.
But in my time, there were about 26. You have some injuries. You were in absolute trouble. I mean, I remember we were going to Hungary to play. You pick your core of players to go, your 18 players, and when we landed in Hungary, 3 players got injured the Sunday before at their club, and then 1 got injured in training, and we had 14 players going into the game.
Yeah.
We played the game with 14 players. It's a lot different now. In terms of there's 20-something players coming into camp, there's a second team, etc., etc. But yeah, I think our player development, there's probably more avenues for players to get into, meaning, there's MLS, a lot more clubs in MLS. There's a lot more in Europe, and now we have the CPL, even though that's in its infancy, but it's still a catchment basin for players that more or less would have been out the game.
Yeah.
Because I remember I used to ask Sean Fleming and Patrick Tobo, I used to, when we had the under-17s and the under-15s and the under-16s, where are these players going to play? I mean, there were some extremely talented players that just had nowhere to go after they're basically under 20. you know, unless they had some attachment to Europe, etc., etc. You know, so you know, whether we're producing more players now or doing a better job, I don't have the answer for that. But what I would say is we have more players playing at a higher level at both male and female that should allow us to compete at the top of CONCACAF.
Right, right.
I say at the top of CONCACAF because you have to compete there first before you can move on to the world stage.
Right, right, right. And talking about CONCACAF and the U17s, but so, I mean, if you look at the results, the boys didn't do well, right? They lost all 3 games. They lost to Mali, who eventually played, I think Mali beat Argentina in the semifinal 3-0. So they didn't do as well, right, at that world stage, but they did well in CONCACAF, to Stephen's point, right? The thing is, you know, my thought has been that we can measure performance on the day. You play the game, you win, you lose. You know, we can measure that. But learning is a long-term process. So did these boys learn a valuable lesson? Did the coaching staff learn a valuable lesson? Did the Canadian Soccer Association learn a valuable lesson from this? And can they put plans together to do better next time, right? If you were you, Bassam, and I know this is, you know, it's a hard question, but nothing is too hard for you. How would you improve that pathway from, you know, U16, U17 to go to the World Cup, and then, you know, we learn from the experience, and how can we make it better?
Well, you have, well, first I watched all the games, and then I read the majority of the reports in the media, and I find that historically it's been the same kind of a repetition of, we've had a good experience, that was a good trip, we've gained some experience, but those players that come and go, and Stephen just mentioned that as a national team, you're looking at maybe 2 or 3 from that group going into the first team, potentially. In general. So if we're looking at it and we're saying, if we're just, and then I go back to what I said in my first, what are our objectives and how we're preparing for it? Do we want to participate as a nation and just take part of those big events, i.e. the World Cup and other competitions? Or do we want to go and actually, because we have talented players already that we've had worked with for years and prepared and spent time and money with top level educators, preparing them to go there to compete, to showcase themselves. So I don't blame, in a sense, I don't blame nor the boys, our players, nor the coaching staff, because I don't know if they do have objective or they're just working what they have. Just Stephen mentioned, and I know Stephen for years, obviously, we mentioned that before, about his experience with the first team in terms of budgeting and preparations and staffing. And in my mind, when you take what he's saying into perspective, they've done decently well with little that they have. Today, the picture is totally different. And when we look at other national teams in general and top nations, Canada as a country, we look at, if we compare Canada for the rest of the world, we're in the top G7, meaning we're in the top 7 economies in the world, meaning we're in the best, one of the best country, if not the best country in the world. I don't know exactly the answer, but we're up there. So obviously we are doing something as a nation to be in the top 7 countries from that perspective, from the economical perspective. So we're talking about football. When we look at our players and we look at players from other nations, you see that the majority of top nations that they're going into those competition, the majority of these players, either they are already a professionally contracted players somewhere in clubs, either in their own country or outside of their own countries, or they are players who are potentially going to go into that professional level, or they're trying to be showcased for that. So they all have a certain objective out of it. And I think that's my biggest, I guess, I don't understand what is our objective. And I go back to that, or our goals and our aspiration as a nation. Is it just to be there? So if you're just to be there, then we've been there and we've learned the experience and we keep going. And we're going to keep saying that we've got good experience and it's nice trip and the rest of it for the group. Or are we going to put a system, a national system in place from Canadian for Canadian based on the best developmental models? There is no more secret. You can find it on the internet today. You need to implement it. It costs money, it costs resources, it costs top level educators, and train these players in their own environment first, and then bring them into the national environment and train them and prepare them for that competition so you can represent your country in the best way possible. That I don't believe we have. In fact, I don't believe we even have a national training center for our players to gather in, or for our coaches to gather in. That's even needed 20 years ago, 30 years ago in my mind, if you want to develop young players and compete with them. You just cannot do it in an amateur environment with coaches who are mom and dad. So what Stephen is saying, and it's truly correct, that despite all the difficulty, there will be players developed, but not in a systematic and a well-organized manners to actually achieve certain objectives, whether they're national or just personal to that matter.
And I think everybody listening to this and watching this will agree with what you said, that there needs to be a system, right, where you bring, locally, you have these development centers locally, and then you bring them together nationally, and so you give access to everybody to be coached by good coaches, by qualified coaches, and then you bring the best players together. I think the OPDL has been an attempt at that kind of setup. League One as well. League One, from my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, but from my understanding, was supposed to be the next step for graduating OPDL players, or a good 16, 17, even 15-year-old perhaps could play League One. And then from there, the CPL, Stephen, was created and so on, to give all of these players the opportunity to progress, right? And into a higher level of play. I think somehow we missed that, especially only my experience with League One, where now we have, we don't have a lot of young players playing there. I would like to see in League One, our best 16, 17, 18 play there and develop more for the CPL, and then hopefully from there for the national team. Stephen, Richard, what are your thoughts on that? About,
Tony, can I just...
You had some experience with that as well.
Tony, can I just...
absolutely, Stephen, absolutely.
Just, sorry, Richard, my apology, but
yeah.
We have a huge elephant in the room. And I think it is something that we need to address, or at least let's be realistic about. It is extremely expensive to play soccer in Canada at a youth level. Extremely expensive. So my question is, and I know I'm not picking on anybody, because I know a lot of academies do their best to bring people in and cover the cost and all of that. But, if we look at basketball, for an example, and what is happening in their development model, right? You have to ask ourselves, are we missing a lot of potential talent? Because if you watch our demographic now of immigration, are we missing potentially a lot of talent simply because they cannot afford to play the game? And I know I have a very good friend. He has a very talented son and an extremely talented daughter. And when he is telling me what it's costing the family for them to play at the next level, right? The higher you go here, it's the more expensive it gets. Good. I I really would like to know how that's impacting our player development. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and you know, and you talk about the elephant in the room. I think it's a zoo, you know, full of elephants. It's a huge issue and a huge problem. Richard, I know you have something to say about it.
Well, okay, and actually, I'm glad Stephen mentioned that.
Be nice, Richard.
I'm a nice guy, you know.
Right.
So I guess the first concern that I have with player development here, and I know Bassam touched on this too, right, is that what we've done is we've kind of at the provincial and national level buried our heads in the sand and said, well, all the best players are in the OPDL or the provincial high performance leagues, and then from that, of course, we bury our heads even further and we say, well, then all the best players from there are in the MLS academies. And so if we recruit and identify our entire under-17 national team from those 3 MLS academies, well, of course we have all the best players because they came from those programs. And, not going backwards and thinking about the quality of the coaching of those programs, the intensity of the training of those programs, the costs of those programs, not at TFC and the other MLS academies, obviously, but the provincial high performance programs, that come before them. So that's the first issue, is that we cannot bury our heads in the sand and think that all the best and most talented players are there. The second point about League One, and I know, Tony, you mentioned, I agree with you. It would be nice to see all of our best 16, 17, and 18-year-olds playing in that league. Absolutely. Now, not only do we not know anything about the actual developmental age of the teenagers in the high performance leagues, in the MLS academies, or in League One, and we don't know it, not because it's hard to do, not because it's expensive, but because there's never been anybody in a leadership position in any province or in Canada that understands the science and can do those tests and collect that information. And that's because we have poor leadership. But in any case, first of all, we don't even know whether the teenagers are developmentally ahead, behind, whatever. And on top of it, we have this ridiculous rule that just came out, which says that players who are 16 and 17 years old, if they want to move from the OPDL into League One, they cannot unless they are considered an exceptional player. And guess where those exceptional players have to come from? Well, they have to come from either having been identified by a provincial program, by a CPL club, or by an MLS club. That leaves no room for all of the potentially talented teenagers who have been identified by clubs in South America, in Europe, maybe even in Africa, who knows, anywhere else in the world. They don't fall under that exceptional player rule. So we have, sort of it stems from incompetent leadership, but we have all kinds of bureaucratic and educational and competence-based barriers that are preventing us from actually identifying who the most talented players are. And then we get to the cost. So, Stephen, I agree with you. It's way too expensive to play high-level soccer here in Canada, but the cost in and of itself isn't the biggest problem. I think it's a problem. The biggest problem is that there is gatekeeping going on, which means that the pathway that leads to the high performance, youth national, professional, and senior national team goes through that expensive program. So if soccer, like if we were free of OPDL and we could have very, very cheap leagues, I mean, who knows? I don't know what the cheapest it could be to run a team that has to rent fields and all that. Let's just say it might be a few $1,000s on the low end. And then, on the high end, you have whatever. It could be as high as $10,000, let's say. But all of those environments, including the most cost effective, the lowest price, all of them were part of the pathway, and players had an actual opportunity to be identified, then the cost in and of itself wouldn't bother me as much. What bothers me more than the cost is the fact that there's gatekeeping going on. And we know for a fact that if that gatekeeping exists, we can't possibly be identifying all of the most talented players, because we're limiting our identification to only those who are talented and can afford it.
Can I interject, Tony?
Yeah, Bassam, I was just going to ask you.
Sure. There's no secret that I run a private academy, right?
Yeah.
So I'd like to interject, and I do agree with Stephen 100%. And in all honesty, I believe that I truly believe that really not much is working properly in our country when it comes to soccer or football. Nor private academy, nor community clubs. There is a lot of people that have the goodwill to do better. That's for sure. And I think there's quite a bit of good people in the game. I would never discredit that. And there's some knowledgeable educators for sure. But it's not working. The reason why we exist, or I exist as a private academy, is because of the difficulties and the problems that exist in the game. I should not exist should the system be like a proper European model. If we look at all developing, all advanced countries in football, they don't have these problems that we're having at all. They don't. And the costs should never be very high. We charge money. There's no secret about that, because we have expenses, and it's in some ways we're not even. I'm speaking to myself. We're not even true academies. We're really a skeleton of a European academy. If we are going to be bluntly honest, we're a skeleton. But we've been born because of the issues and the problems that exist in the system for the last 30, 40 years. And there's no one is willing to take that step and take the leadership. And we need the Canadian government to be involved to finance the game. We need the banks most probably to be involved. We need major corporations to come into it. We're charging people, we're monetizing that game to death. So I'm the first one to say, I do agree. And I wish I can find an equation to charge all the players that I have $0, not even a penny, $0. But if anybody can find me that equation, I would love to speak to them tonight in our environment, okay, in this Canadian environment.
Yeah, no, but you are 100% right. And Stephen, I didn't want you to bring it up.
No, it's okay. It's great.
No, the elephant in the room. I didn't want you to bring it up, but I was hoping somebody would bring it up, because I also have an issue with that. And my issue is, how many times do you hear clubs and coaches say, well, our main focus is player development? Is that really true? Is that a believable statement? Or is it just, they're saying that because it's what parents need to hear? Oh, player development. We run a high performance. What the hell is high performance? Can you tell me what high performance is? What is it? This player development, and Bassam said it, Bassam, I'm referring to the beautiful game, keeping the game beautiful. We have taken the beautiful game and we have made a huge business out of it. Maybe for the reason that Bassam mentioned before, out of necessity, or maybe an opportunity to make money. Let's be honest, guys. People that are watching and listening, let's be honest. People make a lot of money out of this. Clubs make a lot of money out of this. Clubs criticize the OSA, but like Jessup said in A Few Good Men, you need me on that wall, you want me on that wall, and then you criticize the way I do it. So they criticize the OSA because the OSA is always telling them what to do, but they need the OSA to run those programs so they can survive, they can make money. Clubs make a lot of money. Some of them earn it. Some of them earn it by providing good programs, good opportunities. Some of them, they're not developing anything. They're just developing their bank accounts. That's all they're doing. Some clubs even manufacture jobs for their administrators by charging the kids and all of that. So, there is a lot, to be said about our system. And Bassam and Stephen and Richard, we have talked before about things like it's too expensive, there's too much money going around, and people are taking advantage of that. And that's a shame. That is a real shame. And when I hear clubs and coaches say, oh, we're doing it for the kids. I want to slap them. Honestly, I want to slap them. Like, come on, shut up. I know why you're doing it. You're doing it for a paycheck. You're not doing it for the kids. So, you know, maybe I've gone a little bit, you know, too much on that side. But on the issue of the OSA, and then we're going to go into player ID. On the issue of the OSA, I'm not defending them. But what I'm saying, though, is that, you know, academies, clubs, they blame the OSA for everything that happens. But they need the OSA to make money. They need the OSA to stay alive. If the OSA doesn't run the OPDL, clubs don't make a lot of money. Richard and I, you figured it out. We figured out how much money clubs make from OPDL teams. We're talking about $600,000-$700,000 a year to run OPDL programs. That's a lot of money. They have a lot of expenses as well. So coaches blame clubs. Clubs blame the OSA. The OSA blames the CSA. The CSA blames Nick Bontes. Bontes blames Christine Sinclair. And we blame everybody, but we don't come together and say, okay, guys, how can we make this better? And I think we need to do that. I think we need to do that. I think we have to stop lying to parents about this high performance. It hurts me, you know, when I hear that and when I see that. I think I better stop here. I might be going to jail. We might all be going to jail. So we're going to move to the next one, the player ID. So, I mean, is there, we have touched on it a little bit, but is there a formula? Is there a specific pathway? Is there a specific approach at, you know, trying to identify, you know, the best players in Canada? I know we have the OPDL and TFC and Vancouver and all of that. But Stephen, I'll go back to you. So do you have any recommendations about how to best identify talent in Canada, given all the difficulties that we have?
Well, look, it's a difficult process, okay? Simply because the size of the country, and we know all of that, right? But they're more than the majority of the population live between Quebec City and London, right? You have over 20 million people living in that strip of land. Okay, so there's a couple players there, okay, and I think the reality is, and I can only talk about when I did the job, okay. The reality is, you know, from my personal connections, I try to connect with as many coaches as possible that I thought had the experience that can identify what an under 15, 16, 17 international player looks like. Because sometimes, you know, people say to you, you know, we have a really good player, blah, blah, blah. And then you go look at the player and the environment that the player is in, the player looks the part, but it's certainly not ready yet for that level. So again, with a lack of the resources, what you have to do is to use the resources that you do have at hand. And you have to trust, and I do believe we have some very good coaches in this country, right? Very, very good coaches. And a lot of those coaches would be more than willing to help with the identification of players. You know, I mean, in my time, I would get coaches to take me down to Eglinton Flats and the Spanish League, and in Quebec, we you know, they had an African league and et cetera, you know, and identify those coaches that can help you at least see these players. You know, get a grip for these players. But the problem is, if you don't have an investment in the program, and what I mean by an investment, an avenue where you can bring all these players in together, go through some sort of training, you know, we're not talking about extensive, but some sort of training, and then some sort of showcase for you to see them together. Not in their own little environments.
Yeah.
And you know, to be fair, I don't want to pick on anybody, but I think because of a lack of resources, the staff responsible for the programs, the national programs, have no real choice but to look at those programs, which you called it out, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, etc., that have already done the legwork. Or at least you have to trust that they've done the legwork.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm not saying they've done the legwork. I'm saying that's the limitation you have to work with, right? And then you try to identify some players that are in the United States or in Europe somewhere, or in South America or Latin America or whatever. But again, you know, it's a complex process. And in my time, we had a national training center under Holger Osek. We could have brought those players into the Ontario Center or the Quebec Center. Quebec had Sportitude at the time. I don't know if they still have it. They probably do still have it. I always liked that program. You could have brought players into the Atlantic Training Center. We had a number of female players from the Atlantic that represented the women's national team, right? So we had a sort of an avenue to pull these players in. No, it was not ideal, but again, you could only work with what you have, right? So I think the first thing, and Bassam said it, and Richard said it, you know, what are your aims and objectives? And then within your capacity, whatever the investment is or the commitment is, try to do your best to get the job done. Because let's face it, you know, Canada might be a G7 in the top, or whatever Bassam said in the G7. I'm not as smart as him, but you know, we are not there in football. Okay, we are not even close when it comes to football, because in football, your population doesn't really matter, else India and China would be on top, right? What matters is how many people you actually have playing football, right? That's your population that you need to identify and to have some sort of working model with. And of course, the coaches that go with that.
No, well said, Stephen, well said.
Can I, sorry, Tony, I want to comment on a couple of things that Stephen said.
Yeah, I'll go ahead, Richard.
Very, very important. That,
I have a question for Bassam, and you know,
right,
I don't want you to take all the time.
Right, just quickly then, because I think, you know, obviously it's correct, right? We have to sort of operate under the assumption that the MLS academies have done the legwork. And I mean, okay, I know for a fact that at least one of them has not. You know, I'm not naming names or anything, but okay, you know, scouting is like one of the things that keeps coming up. We just did a webinar last week with Eric Ramsey, who's on the first team staff at Manchester United. Before that, he worked in Chelsea's academy for about 6 years, and that topic kept coming up. How much attention to detail the top professional clubs and the top national teams put into scouting. You know, and we don't have that, so we've kind of basically you know, outsourced scouting. You know, and I think we need to do better with it. You know, and then the second thing, if we're talking about population and you know, economy and all that, predicting performance of the national team, you know, there's a good book called Soccernomics that actually used a real good statistical approach. Stephen, I think maybe, did you read that one or? Yeah,
I have.
So what they found was you have three main predictors. Population is one, GDP is a second, and so with those two, Canada, you know, should do really well. The third is what they called football experience, and there was all kinds of different metrics that went into that, like how many years you've had a professional league, as you said, Stephen, how many players are playing, at what level they're playing at, all of that. And when you look at that metric, that experience metric, that's where you see the difference between Canada and, you know, the Western European countries.
Richard, I mean, when it comes to professional teams, we're basically young.
We don't, right.
Yeah, we're very, very young. But so talking about player ID, talent identification. So when you go to France, I know you have very close working relationship in France with clubs and with the federation and other places as well. So when you take these players to France, What are they looking for, and what are you looking for before you bring them there? And I'm talking, Bassam, I'm talking about the technical, the tactical, the physical, the mental, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah. First, let's be beyond realistic with ourselves here before we get to that. We are what we call, or I call myself and my colleagues who I work with, we're a technical guide to players. Even though we're certified, we have good knowledge, we work on a full-time basis in the game in Canada. We do not have the environment and the ongoing facility. We don't have the proper facility, environment, funding to prepare players for that environment directly. So we give them a good foundation in the game. And the key to foundation is between the ages of 11 to 14, 15. Those are the crucial keys in terms of training, educating, and improving the technical element of the game. I'm going to say it very bluntly, guys. Technique is the alphabet of football. If you're not technically sound, you cannot speak, you cannot write, you cannot do anything. Without technique, there's no tactics. Technique alone is not good enough. Obviously, it has to have a component of physicality and tacticality after that in the future.
But you build from that. You build from that.
So we give them that solid base environment, I believe. They are naturally have an appetite and attitudes to become better as well. We bring coaches, we invite coaches to come and watch our athletes first. We just don't take them there. We invite them, they give us what they think it's lacking, but what they love about is they find the Canadian player has passion. Maybe it's not the passion, the amazing passion, but passionate enough. They are well-disciplined, they're polite, they listen, they're willing to learn. Now, the adaptation when you get there is totally different. That's where our Canadian players struggle, in fact, in the adaptation outside of their own Canadian environment. We have a great life. This is a great country. We have such a comfortable environment. Football is not about comfort, people. Football is about competition and training day in and day out, and to maintain a certain level and to take your level one step every 6 months, 1 year, 1 season, one step at a time forward. And you are judged. Your opinion doesn't matter. Your parents' opinion doesn't matter. No opinion matters. What matters is the people that watching you and they're looking for what they're looking for their own environment. So what we do, we find that's working for us is we give them a good base and we're truly, truly honest about it. That's what we do. We do not develop players. We don't have the environment, nor the financial ability, nor the facilities to do so, nor the professional environment to say, okay, we're developing for what? We prepare them, they see them, and they see something in them, and they take a risk on them to invite them into their European environment. Some of our kids are succeeding because they go there, and now they're being in a new, totally different environment. I can tell you guys, and I don't have to tell you, some of you, obviously, most of you have traveled and seen it. But they look, now you go from, I call it football trouble to football heaven. Europe is football heaven, I call. From football trouble in our environment to football heaven, where the coaches are there day in and day out, are there to work to improve the player. That's their job. And the player is there day in and day out to showcase themselves and to become better, to potentially make it to the pro. So the system is there for them. It's very, very clear. Like our educational system in Canada, it's very, very simple. I'll tell you a little story quickly. I did a test with 40 of my own athletes in a classroom session. I said, can anybody explain to me the educational system in Canada? It took us 2 minutes to understand that you go from kindergarten to grade 1 to grade 12 to university and so on. And it took us 45 minutes of argument to not understand what's our soccer system in our country. Yeah. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody, I think, I know, maybe I've heard. I think OPDL, no, it's private academy. No, it's League One. No, it's this, it's that. we're so dissected, we're so unorganized, and we have no national system in place for our kids to guide themselves. They're lost, their parents are lost. So when you guys have a very good discussion last time, I've listened to it, I was out of the country, and there was a question that was that a session of being negative? What's the solutions? Well, we're talking, as we're having those discussions today, we're giving solution. We need a national system from Canadian for Canadians, very clear, very defined, so we can all work within that system and serve our country properly. We deserve that. If we don't have that, we're going to be talking for the next 20, 30 years about the same thing again and again and again. Because I remember 20 years ago, I spoke about the same things, and 20 years later, we are still speaking about the same thing. Mind you, I have a better, nicer tracksuit, and there's nicer balls, and there's nicer...
Yeah, but you lost your hair, Bassam. You lost your hair.
And I lost my hair. Here you go.
Did he have it?
Much better.
Bassam, I agree with you about culture and the environment and the role that they play in setting all of this up, right? Because each country, obviously, they have different cultures, different environments, and they tailor their development together with
Absolutely.
all of what they have. Somehow we're missing on that, and if we can try to fix that, and it will take time. Perhaps in the end, we will do a better job, at the end. But I want to say something about player ID, because somehow I'm involved in it. I do scouting for the OSA for their OPDL programs. So having been involved in the game for 50 years and coached at every level of the game except CPL and MLS. I think I've earned I've earned, the right to be able to go out and look at some kids and say, he can play, she can't play, and so on and on. Anyway, I enjoy it. I love it. I scout maybe, I would say 20, 30 games a season. I love it. There are some good quality players being developed. But you can see at the early age, there is some potential. There is some physical talent, there is some technical talent, there is some smarts out there. You can see it. You can see it. And the thing that scares me is that, okay, what do we do now? Where do we go now? How do we get these kids going? Do they end up going to TFC, Vancouver, somewhere else? And then what? What happens to the other ones? There are ones that develop later, and so on and on. So going back to my role, I scout for the OSA, for PDL programs. I recommend these players, the ones that I identify as having some capabilities, to the OSA. There is also times when I do my scouting and I go and talk to the coaches and I say, hey, listen, I've identified 3 or 4 players and I'm going to recommend them to the program at the OSA. And they say to me, I know, we don't want anything to do with that. I am not sending my players to the OSA. And, well, why? Well, no, there are my players, they don't go there. We are focused on going to the States and getting a scholarship and so on. So, there is also opportunities for these kids to go there, but some coaches take it upon themselves to say, no, you're not going. And that's wrong, right? That's wrong. I'm sure, from my experience, there are other organizations as well who think that the players belong to them, and they're not willing to release them, to say, hey, you know what? Go and experience that. See what it's like. What's the worst thing that can happen? Right? And so on. So I hope I'm doing a good job at scouting these kids and recommending them. But I'm taking something from there. I'm going to jump into the next one. But
Tony, I can give you a joke about that, actually.
Yeah, go ahead, Stephen. Go ahead.
When I was coaching the under-17 national team, I went to see, I wouldn't say which province, which club or whatever, but I went to see a team play. Carlos Rivas had told me about I just sold it out. But anyway, told me about some players, and I went to see the players play, and I said to the coach, before the game, I said, look, I'm here to look at 2 or 3 of your players. And please, if you don't mind, after the game, please don't tell them. And then after the game, can I have a chat with them and potentially their parents, right? Halftime, the 3 players were subbed out, put in a taxi, and sent home. I never got to talk.
No,
I never got to talk to them. So you're quite right. You know, there are obstacles. There are people out there that, you know, they don't want them involved.
Yeah, and Stephen, after our last webinar, or the first one on this topic, Richard, we got a letter from a gentleman in Quebec, Charles Topin, and now Charles took his son from Quebec. He took him out of Quebec and brought him to England, where he joined a school there in England. He goes to school there, and so that he can pursue his soccer development in another country, because he thought he didn't have the opportunity to do it here. So there are those opportunities as well, but they're very, very expensive. But to Bassam's point before is, these young men shouldn't have to do that. These young men and other young men and women like him shouldn't have to do that. They should be able to stay here, get the development here, and get the opportunities here to move on and do something good for themselves in soccer. But I want to jump into coaching development just a little bit, because we don't have a lot of time. So coaching development, that's been that's been an ongoing issue for over 100 years, as long as I've been involved in the game. You know, we always talk about coaching development. And we at the NSCAC, we have tried here, Richard, over the years to provide, you know, opportunities for coaches to enrich, you know, their knowledge and by inviting guests and so over and so on. But coaching development, Stephen, can it be better in Canada? What are your points on that? What are your thoughts on that?
Wow, we need another whole seminar for that, to
I
be
know,
honest.
I know.
Look, you know, when Jason DeVos was a blogger and not involved, he wrote an excellent article about coaching and the expense of coaching, and it was keeping back potential coaches, etc., etc. Well, I think right now coaching is more expensive than it's ever been before. And you have to go through all these sort of levels for the club licensing, and anyway, it's a massive task. And there are a lot of people that have been in the game for a very long time that, in my experience with other countries, they do their best to get those people to stay in the game and be part of the development pathway, development model, etc. Does not seem to be the case here. And the one thing I'd say about coaching development is you could, and Bassam could talk about this, and Richard, you could have how much certification you want, right? The reality about coaching is you have to coach. You have to be in that environment daily, right? You need that in order to develop your coaching. And I've been to over probably 50 countries in the world studying football, watching everything from under 10 to senior professionals, etc. And I go to a lot of youth coach training here in this province, and I just sit down and I watch. But I'll tell you this, I have not seen any coaching development that addresses 40, 50, 60 kids in a 60 by 40 area, and you're calling that some sort of development. You know, the environment is simply not there, right? And it's a very difficult process, because you're asking people to spend a lot of money to become educated in the coaching field, fair enough. But can we provide for them on a professional level? Because that's the reason people go into some sort of education. right, is to bring it towards some sort of professional level. And I mean, I would say right now it's virtually impossible because we have such a small environment, such a tight environment, that it's very, very difficult to develop coaches beyond, I'm talking beyond the certification process.
Right. No, it's been going on, it's been going on for a while. I mean, everything is expensive. If you want to play, it's expensive. If you want to become a better coach, it's expensive. You either have to, to better yourself, you have to pay for this coaching certifications that the OSA or the CSA runs, or you have to go somewhere else. You have to go abroad to learn about coaching and all of that. So it's very expensive, and in the process we lose some good talent, because there is talent in coaches as well, and a lot of them, like our good friend Patrice, don't get the opportunity to do that, and so they give it up. They walk away. They find other things to do, and we lose that talent. And even though we may recognize it, but there is no one there, and there are no opportunities for this talented coaches to show off their stuff. And they just give up and they walk away. But Sam, what are your thoughts on that? I see smoke coming out all over.
I can just give you some of my experience and maybe some recommendation. I got my A license in 2002. So that's 21 years ago. It took me 9 years to get my A license in Canada. And it took me 2 years to get my A license in UEFA. It's a little bit of a different environment. And it took me 2 years to get hold of somebody to renew my license, actually, as well. So as Stephen has said, the environment itself is extremely, extremely difficult. The country is a humongous. The investments is needed, is very, very large, and it should be subsidized. Coaching development should be subsidized by our Canadian government, actually, because you're investing into people to become better educators. I shouldn't be investing in myself to be an educator. I've invested in myself. I'm sure Stephen has. I'm sure yourself as well. But that should be subsidized. That's how it is in the rest of the world. When you show that you have some kind of a knowledge or a natural attributes to be an educator or a teacher of the game, somebody will have to help you. So I believe that we're missing out on a lot of coaches to become better in this country. The other point that I want to bring out is we are so blessed in this country of being such a beautiful mosaic of humanity. We have people from all over the world. I mean, you just look at the screen right now, and we all come from different background and heritage and colors and religion and the rest of it. And that's the beauty of Canada. And that's actually richness that we're not digging into. We have coaches coming from so many different places with certification, to that matter. And we deny them to even contribute properly in the game because maybe their language is they're not well immersed in the English language yet, or the French language, to say on the Quebec side. So you alienated so many people in the game. You alienate so many players at the same time in the game, because Stephen mentioned that he's been to different leagues, and I know leagues going on all over the place, Spanish league, Asian leagues, all kind of ethnic leagues that exist in this country, and there's players playing there nobody knows about. Nobody has a clue who they are. And so our coaches as well, in educator, they most probably don't feel that they're fit in the system. So it's a humongous, humongous task. And again, I'm always repeating, and I hope I'm not being, we need to, the start is our Canadian government, not just Canada Soccer. Canada Soccer is just an association that actually it's an entity. Education in Canada doesn't come from one board of education or one association. It's actually started by the government. The Canadian government should very much so get involved and finance a major part of sports, specifically soccer, specifically coach education, and have programs for people to get into those areas in order for us to get better as a nation because a good teacher, a good student in general. Richard, in the last discussion, he mentioned everywhere in the world, physicians are taught by professional physicians. You cannot have a surgeon in a hospital that taught by an amateur doctor. They have a professor who's done surgery for years that they give them that knowledge. So is lawyers, so is electricians, so is plumbers. I don't know why we expect it differently in this game that we love. It's just we cannot be born coaches. We're not born just coaches. And I totally agree with Stephen, even though I hold multiple certification. If you don't have the national attributes to actually work in the game day in and day out and learn and accept your failure and learn from your failures and move forward, you can have so many certifications. It doesn't mean nothing, in fact. It truly doesn't mean nothing. You can just put them on the wall.
Yeah, no, because you don't have an opportunity to do and show what you have been training for years and years and years, right? You don't get that opportunity to do that. Richard, so you and I have talked about this many, many, many times. And you know, coaching education, it's not just about, again, kicking the ball, passing, shooting, dribbling, and so on. There is also a scientific approach to that. And I know you know the courses that you run on the physical component on that. And you want to talk about that a little bit and how, you know, that connects with the technical and the tactical and overall, you know, coaching development as well, right?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. And maybe even before I do that, I'll touch on just some of the comments from Stephen and Bassam, because it's interesting, like just a personal experience. And actually, funny enough, that Bassam was the one that got me involved in coaching. And it's almost 25 years ago now. But and at the time, now we're talking about opportunity and money and everything. At the time, Bassam was with a club in Kleinburg. And the coaching opportunity, I was only 21 years old, right? But the opportunity was, here's a team and you can coach them for free. So as a young guy getting started in the game as a coach, and I was still playing and all that at the time, but basically, you know, I don't even know. I mean, there were probably very, very few coaches at any level that were making any money at all. And in the, you know, in the subsequent 20 years or so from that, now we have, you could argue, you know, we have much more opportunity. Is it full time? Is it paid well? You know, no. But sometimes that's driven by, you know, supply and demand and the market and all that. So, you know, there are opportunities. And the other thing, just about education and subsidy and all that, you know, I think it's worth mentioning that, you know, no matter whatever you want to do for your career, you are going to invest in your education. And often, if you want to get to the higher level, whether that's an A license or a pro license or a PhD or a whatever, you know, professional courses and all that, you know, the cost goes up and sometimes it's subsidized. Some other countries subsidize education a lot more, but I don't know of too many countries that subsidize education after high school where the subsidy isn't merit-based. So what I mean by that is if the government is going to get involved subsidizing coach education, then first of all, the coaches that are applying, you know, they better be quality, and we better have some kind of standardized, objective way to measure the competence of those coaches. Stephen mentioned it. Experience is important. We need to be able to measure knowledge. We need to be able to, and then, you know, obviously licenses and all that factors into it. So only the competent people get access to free education. That's one. And then the second thing, Bassam touched on it. I know I've mentioned it many times and I'll say it again, the quality of the instructors, and that goes from the people who make the curriculum and the ones who teach it. You know, you can't go to a top country in the world and see, you know, UEFA licenses, South American, you know, the CONMEBOL licenses. The instructors that are there are the best coaches in the country. They have masters and PhDs. They have A and pro licenses. They've coached in the pro game for like decades. You don't get to be an instructor until that's your level. And we have to ask ourselves the question, is that the level of the people that are instructing the courses here? You know, and I'm not even going to answer it. I'll just leave it out there. Now, about the sports science component. Well, this is part of the problem. And it's you know, it's the one that I'm probably the most knowledgeable about. everywhere else in the world, first of all, most of the coaches that get into coaching at the professional academy level or above, most of them, they're either, there's two profiles. One is a former professional player who played at a very high level, and maybe they get grandfathered in at some point, or it's somebody who has a sports science degree. So they start with an education level of sports science that nobody in Canada starts with. And then the courses themselves, again, taught by experts, they are very demanding, making sure that coaches know about sports science, about warm-ups, about periodization of training, about injury prevention, about nutrition, all of it. You don't get to a higher level in good football countries that educate coaches without knowing about sports science, and most of them come into it with a good background anyway. Again, I can speak from experience, okay? In Ontario, basically you learn nothing about sports science. At the Canadian licenses, it's about, I mean, the word bare minimum, that's the way to describe it. It's about as low quality, low in terms of quantity. It's maybe they spend an afternoon on it, and there's no test, there's no exam, there's no nothing. So that means that the standard in terms of educating coaches about sports science is basically non-existent. What do we get resulting from that? Well, we get lots of coaches here that have an A license, and they work as technical directors, and they work as coaches at the university level, and the League One and all of it, and they know nothing about periodization, and they know nothing about injury prevention, and they know nothing about fitness. And so often, and I'm sure Bassam can probably attest to this, one of the things that always happens when we send players to Europe who have been coached by these people educated in Canada with no sports science and fitness knowledge is the players are told that they're not fit enough. And they're not fit enough because they're not training hard enough. And they're not training hard enough because the coaches are not don't know how to train hard because they've not been taught. So, well,
Richard, Richard.
And by the way, my suggestions to address that would be literally the antithesis of what we do now. So
yeah. But Richard, the thing is, like I was saying before, every little component from a coaching point of view, everything that you learn as a coach, whether it's on the physical side, on the mental side, on the technical, or the tactical, when you put them all together, will definitely make you a better coach. In dealing with the players and training them and developing them. The principal role of the coach should be to support the development of players, right? Like Bassam was saying before, we're just guiding you along. We're supporting your development. But coaches also need to make sure that they support their own development, right? But in some places you can do it better than you can here. I'm sorry, but it's the way it is. Here
the only caveat there, it's just something that I've seen from traveling, and even Stephen, what comes to mind is Alejandro, who worked with us last year, and how many coaches, even top coaches that have worked in the professional game in Europe and South America, and I mean I get Facebook messages all the time. How many of them want to come here to work? I don't know that we can just necessarily think that there's more opportunities elsewhere. There are opportunities, but it's very competitive, and often you get very good quality coaches, very knowledgeable and everything. And
well, listen, we have that on our panels.
We have
Stephen, Bassam, Rafael, last week, and others who have tons of experience. But for one reason or another, they don't have the opportunity to share it. I would like to sit down, and Stephen, and I'm not saying this because you're there, but I've seen you and I've seen you work. I would love to sit down one day with Stephen Hart and pick his brain.
You only need 2 minutes, Tony.
No, but I'm talking about the experiences, Stephen, and of course your knowledge, and the same with Bassam, and the same with Rafael, who is in Paraguay coaching, and other coaches as well. I want to hear their experiences. I want to hear, how they deal with with the player development in their club, on their team, the issues that they have and so on. So I can learn and I can become, that it's not all about passing and receiving. There's a lot more to it, right? And coaches need the opportunity to develop themselves, to continue to develop themselves so that they continue to develop the players, because the game is changing, right? Things are changing. But I don't think we get that opportunity, and unfortunately we don't. Guys, it's 3:30. Yeah, Bassam, do you want to say something else?
Yes, very important that I did not mention. As you know, I've traveled a lot, and I've have a lot of colleagues in Europe, and I have a lot of contacts with European clubs, France and outside of France. But specifically in France, I've been blessed enough that every time I travel and I am at the club, because they host me usually at the club with players or without players, I get invited to their weekly coaches meeting that happen to discuss new trends, to discuss on a weekly basis. Yes, they're full time. Yes, they have. It's a much higher environment. I understand, but they're discussing on a weekly basis new ideas, sharing it out from all age categories. Everybody has the right to have their input, criticizing each other in a positive way, at criticizing player, helping player, finding ways to maybe help a player to improve in throughout their system of development in the club. It's fascinating. The level of they have competition. Of course, they're human beings. They have dislike and like and so on. But the level of respect, the level of sharing information, the level of working, the togetherness, and to invite someone from the outside, you feel so, I'm not sure what the word, so respected in a way.
Privileged.
Beyond privilege as well. And in all honesty, we don't have that in our country. You mentioned in one where there's a jealousy, there's people not sharing information, everybody wants to keep things for themselves. There's no secret in football. It's just a ball and a pitch and people playing. But if you want to play the highest level, or if you want to get to the highest level, then there's a lot of work to be done. And if we don't work together, and if we don't have a national plan, and if we don't have a national identity, and if we don't really believe that we want better for our country, it's never going to happen. And today we don't have it. We don't have any of it in my mind. But we can. We certainly can.
No, I know we can, but Richard, I think it's time to go. Like Mr. Dress Up used to say. I think it's time to go. It's 3:30, but there's a lot more to talk about, obviously, guys. And you know what? I'm going to take the initiative to say that perhaps we can have a part 3, after the holidays, and be more specific with things. I mean, I love listening to Stephen and Bassam and Richard and anyone else that we can bring on, so I can learn about this and other coaches can learn about this. So, guys, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, your opinions, your experiences. I appreciate it. We really appreciate it. There is a lot of work to be done. We are at a point, I think, I don't think, in terms of our national team program, even though we have not been, successful in certain areas, but we have developed some decent players, some good players, actually, that can play at the international level on the women and the men's side. The question is, are we able to sustain that? Are we able to, to provide continuity for that success? And once those players are gone, because they will be gone, unfortunately, they will be gone. How do we provide continuity so that we can keep, developing this player, right? And we can keep, pushing and edging and trying to be better all the time. I think that's the $1 million question. How do we do that? And we need to do that better. We need to be ready to be able to do that, 10 years from now when these guys are retired. Coaching development, it's another, like Stephen said, it's another huge, webinar all by itself and so on. So I think, in all fairness to everybody, there are some things that we do quite well. Some things that we do well, some things that we don't do very well. And those are the ones that we need to fix, and the other ones we need to improve on. And I want to say something, since we're talking about elephants, and then we're going to close it on this one. I want clubs and academies and everybody to stop blaming the OSA and the CSA for everything that doesn't go right. The reason I'm saying that, I'm not saying that you shouldn't. You have the right to say that, to do that, to complain. But if you're going to do it in a way that ask the questions. Go and ask them the questions. Ask. This is what I need to know. This is what I would like to do. Can you help me? And if you cannot help me, then you know what? Then I'm going to try to replace you. I'm going to get you out of there. I'm going to get somebody else in there who can help me. But ask the question. Make your voice heard. If you're a club, don't just sit there and be happy that you have 5,000 kids playing for you and, they're making good money, but you complain about the OSA because you don't like this and you don't like that. Well, be the one that makes that change. Work at making that change, but don't just complain all the time. So there are people like Richard and Bassam who are proactive. We're trying to make the changes. We're trying to be supportive. We're trying to give, advice and so on. And then there are the others that just sit there and they like to complain, but they don't do anything about it. Anyway, I just wanted to say that.
Is there any opportunity for closing remarks?
I'm sorry, Bassam.
Am I allowed to have an opportunity for?
You are allowed to do anything you want. Please go ahead. And Stephen, then I'll give you the same opportunity if you like.
I just want a closing remarks. That's all.
Yeah.
Guys, I thank you very much. Number one, Richard, continue doing what you're doing. You're doing great on social media, bringing up a lot of good topics and a lot of functional and good example of how we can. You're providing a lot of good solution at the same time, and you're providing a lot of information. So congratulations on that. Please keep going. Nothing wrong with that. Don't let anybody hold you back. Guys, I'm personally speaking, and I believe Stephen will agree with that as well. We're the servant of the game. We are Canadian from different background, but I'm the servant of the game of football in Canada or soccer. Okay, it's a privilege to do that. I believe this country has a humongous potential from an ethnicity point of view, from an athletic point of view. It's a rich country. It's a beautiful country. But I believe that we need to be very, very honest with ourselves. We're not a football nation yet. We would like to be maybe a football nation. We have a potential to maybe one day get there. We need to seek that potential. We need leadership that seek that potential and put a plan for all of us to work together. I think that's extremely essential. I don't believe that we need to reinvent ourselves, and we can. We definitely can reinvent ourselves in Canada with a new system, maybe parallel to the system that exists. It does not include potentially those provincial and districts and all these political layers that are not needed in the game for the game to progress. I've been to over, I would say, no different than Stephen, 50 countries. Really, all you need, if you have the grassroots and you have the professional level properly set up, in between, you could have some struggle, but you will produce players. It's been proven, countries after countries. Okay, we have only an organized grassroots and hardly anything after, and just a small professional league in its infancy stages. It's going to take a long time, and we are struggling. I truly believe the Canadian game deserves better. The Canadian players deserves better. The Canadian coach deserves better. The referees deserve better. The administration, the fan in this country deserve better. The parents deserve better. And I believe that the new immigrants, they deserve better. And all the people involved in this country deserve better. I think the Canadian leagues on the highest level deserve it better as well overall. And obviously the most in Canada deserve better. That's my total remarks.
Well said. Stephen, do you have any last?
I'll be brief. I'll be very brief. I think
Thank you.
anybody can identify the problem, but not many people know how to go about rectifying it, right? And I agree with Bassam, only if we come together and agree, disagree, argue, but with the intention of moving forward, right? Because progress is about moving forward, and moving forward in such a way that we can also reflect backward and move further forward again. So with that in mind, season's greetings to everybody, and thank you for having me on the panel.
Yeah, and I'm going to close, Bassam, I'm going to close with your tagline, you know, keeping the game beautiful. You know, we're all working at doing that, at least on this panel. We're working at keeping the game beautiful every day with everything that we do. You know, we're talking about soccer and stuff, and we're going to continue to keep the game beautiful. And hopefully we can have another webinar where we can talk about, you know, all of the good things that we do in terms of soccer, and all the things that can be better, without pointing fingers at anybody, and without, you know, putting the blame on anybody. And like what Stephen said, we work together. We look at the problems. We try to find the solution. We implement it, but together. We do that together because we want to keep the game beautiful. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Wish everyone a good holiday, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Nice to see you guys.
All right.
Take care, Stephen. Bassam, take care.